and want to walk you through tonight the last of our conversations together in this series we've been making our way through called Be Love. And as you know, again, I've probably bored you with the repetition, but I try to remind you that hopefully you feel like you've gotten your money's worth by repeating some of these things and knowing that we've covered a lot of good ground together. And over the course of this series so far, we've been talking about this idea of what it looks like to do everything with love. And it's one of the challenges that Paul, an early church leader, gave to a church he started in Corinth. And he didn't just challenge them to do everything with love. He gave them and all of us a great description of what love actually looks like and is all about. And that was really helpful for us because we said at the very beginning that we believe that the better we get to know love, the better we're able to show love. And so we've been trying to get to know love through an incredible explanation of love that God's given to us through this writer, Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 13. We've also been talking about, of course, along the way, the example of love that God's given to us, specifically in the person of his son, Jesus, who was here 2,000 years ago. And just to kind of recap where we've been with that, here's the passage we've been spending time in over the last 4 weeks in particular, talking about a particular kind of love that we said that was a unique kind of love defined by God for us, not by the world, not by Hollywood, not by a girlfriend, not by your spouse, not by somebody else, defined by God, demonstrated by God in the most powerful ways. And then he looks at us and he says, now this is what I created each of you for as well. And so we've been looking at this puzzle that Paul gave us with all these different pieces, creating this thorough and holistic picture of what love is and looks like and is all about. In the first week of that, we talked about how love is patient and kind and doesn't envy, that it's slow to boil, it's long-suffering, it chooses to look for ways to bless people and benefit people and be good to people and good for people. Our little phrase that week was nutritious and delicious. We said that it doesn't envy, it doesn't get caught up trying to worry about what other people have, wanting what other people have, or not wanting others to have what you want, but instead of competing with others for good things, we choose to celebrate with others the good things that are happening in their life, the things that they have, the things that they're experiencing. We're not competing with them for those, but celebrating alongside of them. We said that love does not boast, it's not proud, it doesn't puff up and over-promote, it doesn't over-defend ourselves, it doesn't over-exaggerate ourselves, but instead, just like Jesus did with us 2,000 years ago, it chooses humility instead, to serve others, to put ourselves under others. We said that it doesn't dishonor other people. It's not rude to them. It doesn't disregard God by devaluing others. It doesn't violate God's design for how we're supposed to treat people and talk to people and think about people. But instead, through our words and our actions and our attitudes and our thoughts, we choose to elevate and honor and esteem people around us. This next one we said we didn't really unpack by itself the idea that love is not self-seeking, but we simply said that that's kind of the centerpiece to the puzzle, that all the other ones kind of revolve around that. All the other ones kind of stem out of that one idea that love is not self-seeking. It's not selfish, it's not self-centered, but rather it's selfless, it's sacrificial, it's unconditional. It doesn't look for what it can get, but it looks for ways that we can give to be a blessing to others. We said that it's not easily angered or easily provoked. It doesn't get pushed over the edge of getting irate and upset, which is easy for so many of us to do. It recognizes that we have idols in our hearts that shouldn't have been there in the first place, but when they are there, many times when people mess with those, it messes with us, right? And we become easily angered, and love chooses to not do that. We said love keeps no record of wrongs. There are no spreadsheets, no scorecards. We're not keeping long lists of things that people have done against us. It doesn't mean that we are naive. It doesn't mean we allow ourselves to be abused by people, but we also choose. We make the choice to offer forgiveness as we've been forgiven, and to choose not to hold those things against, because love keeps no record of wrongs. We said that love doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth, and that it's willing to both bring truth into the lives of other people, but also to be truthful about ourselves with other people, that it leads us into, and love is willing to go into the hard places, the hard conversations, the hard confrontations, and even the hard confessions at times in our life. We said that all is part of what love is. And then last week we talked about this idea that love always protects. And I told you that it's a word that literally means a roof or a shelter over. It's this idea that love chooses to cover over. It doesn't cover up, but it does choose to cover over, to provide safe space, to cover people's shame, and to create security for them so they can be who they are and be real with us en route to becoming all that God has made them to be. It always protects. We said that it always trusts and always hopes. It believes that there is a version of others, a good version of others, that they were created to become, and it believes they can become that with God's work in their lives. Nobody is ever too far gone. Nobody is ever just a lost case. But we continue to believe that with God's work in someone's life, part of loving them is trusting and hoping that they can become the best version of them that God actually made them to be. And then last week at the very end, we talked about how love always perseveres and love never fails. That persevere was the idea of remaining up under. I gave you the image of like a weight on our shoulders that we continue to bear. We continue to stand firm up underneath the burden or the weight of it. We don't let it diminish us. We don't let it discourage us. We don't let it stop us or cause us to give in, but we continue to persevere in our love for others. And love never fails. We said that it never wilts or withers, like flower petals that change with the season or blow away in the wind. Love does not do that. Love continues to persevere and continues to endure. And so when we look at that, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about a lot of stuff. As I told you in one of the early weeks, walking through that wasn't meant to beat us up, but to stir us up, right? You can read those things and think about those things and get a little discouraged at all the things that some of us are failing at with this. And yet the point of it wasn't to beat us up, but to remind us of the ways that God has loved us and the ways that he's calling us to be love in the world around us. And so it's an incredible picture, a great puzzle. We put all those things together, and having talked about all of this, having wrestled with this over the last several weeks, there's one last thing I want to talk about with you tonight. And to do that, what I want to turn our attention to for a moment, we're going to come back to Paul and his letter to the Corinthians at the very end. But before we get there, I want to turn our attention tonight actually to some words of Jesus himself. And I want to share with you a couple stories that we read of conversations that Jesus often found himself in, where I think he sheds some light on this idea of what it means to be love and to do everything with love with others. And so I want to talk to you about that. One of the first passages, we're not going to turn there yet. I mean, you can turn in your Bibles. I'm going to put it up on the screen yet, but it's found in the book of Matthew, chapter 22. So if you have a Bible or you have something on your phone or electronic device, you want to open up a Bible to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew was one of Jesus' earliest followers, one of his good friends, an unlikely character of sorts that Jesus said, "Come, follow me." And Matthew did, and we're thankful he did because he recorded so many of the stories that we have of Jesus in our Bible in this book called Matthew. And it's an incredible conversation I want to draw your attention to here in a moment. Before we get to that, I want to give you a little bit of background and some context of why that will help you understand why what Jesus says here in this conversation was so revolutionary, was such a big deal. It's not controversial to us. If you've been around the church, it's kind of common talk here in our world 2,000 years later. But in Jesus' day, it was almost fighting words. I mean, it was a big deal what Jesus was saying here that we're going to look at in a minute. And I want to tell you why for a moment before we jump into that together. The reason why this was such a big deal is this: going all the way back to the beginning. When God created everything in the very beginning, created a good creation, we believe that it was created by God in a good way. He called it very good when he was all done with it, but it didn't stay that way for very long. The first human beings decided they didn't want to live under God's leadership. They didn't want to submit to his authority in their lives and do things his way. So they weren't sure that they could trust God, and they decided they were going to do things their own way. And as a result, they disobeyed God. And it created a terrible mess of this whole creation that all of us have inherited and endured and in many of our own ways contributed to as well ever since. And yet here's the amazing thing about our God. God never gave up on his original dream or his intention for us or for his creation. He actually had a plan in the beginning. The Bible says that he actually had a plan in place before it all went south to put the pieces back together and to fix what eventually our sin would break. And part of that plan involved a certain group of people. He started way back early on with a guy by the name of Abraham, who he came to one day and he said, "Abraham, you didn't see this coming. You never even dreamed or fathomed or imagined what I'm about to tell you." But he said to Abraham, "Abraham, I have a plan to bless and to heal and to restore the whole world, and I'm going to do it through you and through your family tree and through your descendants." And we see this story then begin to unfold as Abraham has kids who have kids who have kids who have kids. It eventually grows into an entire nation of people that we call the Israelite people or the ancient Jewish people. And so much of the early part, the early half to 2/3 of our Bibles are their story. The story of the Israelite people, the Jewish people that God used, and eventually his plan was to use them to be the family tree that would bring a healer, a rescuer, a restorer, who we believe was Jesus, into the world to fix what we had broken through our sin. And so the story of the Old Testament, or what we see in our Bibles that we call the Old Testament, is a story really of God's interaction with this group of people and an agreement that he made with them to carry out this plan. And an agreement in that day, what we refer to it as, is something, actually it's kind of a fancy word that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you aren't, but it's a word that we call covenant. It was an arrangement where God said, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna use you guys to accomplish something great. Here's what I'm asking of you. And part of it was to bring Jesus into the world, but part of it along the way was to help people see and not forget who God was. The world had lost sight of God. They had drifted away from God. They had come to misunderstand God in so many ways. And so not only did he want to eventually bring Jesus into the world through these people, but he wanted to use them along the way as a light to the world to remind them of who the one true God was and what he was like and what he was all about. And so much of the stories of the early parts of the Bible, if you have a Bible, so much of the early parts of that, the first half to 2/3 of that, are the stories of these people trying to be faithful to what God had called them to do as part of the covenant or the agreement or the arrangement that he had made with them and invited them into with him. Now here's part of the problem for them. They weren't actually very good at it. And not only were they supposed to bring Jesus into the world, again, they were supposed to be a way of kind of bringing people along, back to God along the way, so they were ready for Jesus when Jesus came into the world, but they had a whole slew of problems along the way. They failed in so many different ways, but as part of this, God had said, listen, there's some things that I'm gonna ask you to do that's gonna cause you to live differently than the world around you. And you're gonna stick out and people are gonna make fun of you for it and you're gonna do all sorts of stuff, but it's gonna be part of just being that light that points people to me and part of being my people who I'm gonna use to bring a rescuer into the world. And so even though they weren't very good at so many of the things that God really wanted from them, one thing they got to be really good at was coming up with a really long list of laws and rules and things that they thought that was their ticket to success. If they could do all of these things, God would be happy with them, God would bless them, and life was going to be good. And after a couple thousand years of that, by the time Jesus actually does come on the scene, they'd gotten pretty good at their system of how they did things, and they weren't so ready to change. Now this is where some tension came, because when Jesus came into the world, all of a sudden, everything that had been set in place beforehand with the Israelite people and the Jewish people, all the things that they were to do that were never meant to be the point, but to actually just point ahead to Jesus, now he's here. The one that all of that was all about is finally arrived. He's here in the world, and in doing so, he was coming to actually complete all these things that they had been doing and to fulfill them and to kind of, they were no longer gonna be needed because now the thing that all of those other things were pointing to, now he was here. And as you can imagine, because we're all men and sometimes we can be this way, and some of us are good church people too, and we can be this way as good church people at times, but sometimes it's hard to give up what you know, right? Sometimes it's hard to let go of the traditions and the things that you have in place. And so when Jesus came on the scene, it wasn't as easy as them just embracing him and the things that he was trying to teach and letting go of the things that were actually meant to just point to Jesus. As I was thinking about this, one of the challenges they had in order to follow Jesus and embrace his mission for the world and his plan and what he had come to do, not only for them, but for the whole world, they were gonna have to let go of some of the things that were actually, again, just meant to point forward to him, and yet they were so used to those things, they weren't sure they were ready for that. And as I thought about this, I thought about some different examples of in life and times where you have something that you use for a purpose, for a season, and you get used to it, and then by the time you no longer need it anymore, you can almost kind of keep using it just because you're used to using it, right? And as I was thinking about that, I thought of a lot of different images and examples, but one of the images that came to mind for me was one of those like rolly carts. If any of you ever hurt your leg before or your ankle or something, and to get around, instead of crutches, you put one leg up right on the cart and you kind of wheel yourself around. How many of you have ever had one of those, or you know? Help me out here. You know what I'm talking about tonight, right? Okay, all right. Now imagine, you realize someone uses that because there's something in their leg or in their body that's broken. It's not the way it's supposed to be, right? And ideally, they're gonna use that and realize that it's broken, it's not the way it's supposed to be, but hopefully as eventually things heal up and get better and go back to the way they are supposed to be, they're not going to need that roll cart forever, right? And many of us, we would look at a person who got so used to the roll cart that by the time their leg actually healed and it wasn't broken anymore, it didn't need to be broken anymore, if they continued to ride around the roll cart, we'd look at them and say, wait a minute, you realize you don't need to use that anymore, right? And yet this is exactly what the people in Jesus' day were doing. They had gotten so used to the cart, the thing that was meant to accommodate the brokenness and to remind the people that things aren't the way they're supposed to be. They're not going to be this way forever. Eventually there's going to come someone into the world to heal this and to fix this. It's not supposed to be this way. It won't be this way forever. But here's what we've got for now. We want to keep you moving around in some way to remind you of what you were made to be. So that when it's healed and when it doesn't have to be broken anymore, you're ready to go and to embrace that and to be back to normal the way, again, it was always supposed to be. Jesus came on the scene and he created some tension because he entered into conversations with people that they were used to something that they didn't know, or they had lost sight of the fact that it was only supposed to point ahead to something better than that. And so when Jesus said, "Come follow me," he invited them into something that really stretched them and pushed them in a lot of good ways. And again, it was difficult for them because it was different for them. And what I want to point out for you tonight, kind of the first thing that you have in your notes there is this, that for them then and for all of us here yet today, Jesus came and introduced and invited us into a new and better way. And maybe that's not earth-shattering as you hear that. As I unpack a little bit of this tonight, maybe you'll understand more of what I'm saying with that or why that was such a big a deal. But this was revolutionary in Jesus' day. People did not do that amongst the Israelite people, amongst the Jewish people. If you ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, what's like the word they sing all the time in the movie? They sing the word tradition, right? What was the guess that someone said? Okay, close, all right, but the song Tradition, they sing this. This was their whole way of life, was tradition, and nobody messes with their tradition. Yet Jesus comes, and in the way he was always supposed to, but the people weren't ready for, they weren't expecting, or they weren't willing to be open to, he introduced a new and better way. And here's what's so interesting about what Jesus introduced. It was far less complicated, but far more demanding. In other words, it was much simpler, but not necessarily much easier. You see, they felt good about keeping all their rules and doing all their religious activities and all the things that they thought good religious people were supposed to do. It wasn't necessarily easy for them. It was a lot to keep up with, but at least they knew if I can just do all these things that I think I'm supposed to do, then I'll be okay. But Jesus simplified it way down. He brought something that was much less complicated than what they had all become accustomed to, and yet he raised the bar. It was much more demanding. It wasn't just do this and don't do this, but it's why did you do that? And what's your motivation behind that? And what's going on in your heart when you do that or you don't do that? It was much more demanding, even though it was much less complicated. And I want to illustrate that for you again in this passage. Again, now I'll turn our attention to Matthew 22, to the story that we read here. Again, it may be a familiar one you've heard of before, or you at least heard some bits and pieces from this before if you've been around the church at all. But Jesus, here's what Matthew records for us. His early follower, Matthew, here's what he says about Jesus in Matthew 22. He says, he writes it and describes it this way: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. Now, this is a reference to a couple of different religious leader groups. Amongst the Jewish people, they had, kind of like you do in the church, and amongst Christian churches, you have different kinds of churches and different kinds of Christians and that kind of thing. They had the same thing in Judaism. They had different kinds of religious leaders that believed certain things and other religious leaders that believed other things. And two of those groups were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And they were threatened by Jesus because they realized he was bringing something new. They didn't believe it was better, but they knew that it was new. And it was threatening their whole way of life. It was threatening the authority. It was threatening the respect that they had gained as religious leaders. It was threatening their way of life. So many different things were under threat from their perspective. So they were always trying to trap Jesus and discredit him and get him disqualified from the things that he was doing in some way. And so here we see that the Sadducees had tried their tricks with Jesus and it didn't work. He silenced them. And so this other group of people, the Pharisees, they said, we're gonna give it a shot. We're gonna try to get him tongue twisted and somehow put his foot in his mouth in some way. And so it says one of the Pharisees, an expert in the law, came and he tested Jesus with this question. He said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" This is a big deal, a big question for them because, again, some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, but in their day, over thousands of years of trying to do all the things that they believed God had told them to do as the Israelite, the Jewish people, one of the things that had happened, they had accumulated all these rules and laws and expectations, and many scholars point out probably at the time of Jesus in his day, there was probably over 600 of these different rules and laws and all these lists of things that they were supposed to do. And this guy says, all right, here's a way to trap him. Let's see what he says to this. Hey, Jesus, of all these laws that we have, of all these rules that we're trying to keep, which one is most important? Which one's the greatest? And Jesus, as he did so well, always saw right through that, which I just love about Jesus. And he replied this way. He said, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, this response that Jesus gave is the one that everyone would have expected him to give. This line actually comes from one of the expectations God had given back in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, for the Jewish Israelite people. And it was something that every good Jewish kid would learn early on in their life. They would memorize that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And so Jesus says this is the first and greatest commandment. No surprises there. And then Jesus, you can almost imagine him as they're like, yep, good answer. All right, Jesus, you passed the test. And then he does what he always did so well. He says this, and the second is like it. You can almost imagine the people in the crowd say, wait a minute, we didn't ask you what was the top three. We didn't ask what the top ones were, which was the best ones. We said, which is the greatest, as in one, Jesus, the best top command. And Jesus says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. And the second is like it. What do you mean like it, Jesus? Like it like, sounds like it, or like it like similar to it, or on the same level? And I think what Jesus was saying is essentially these kind of work together, like it in the sense that they carry the same weight. He says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then he says this was revolutionary in Jesus' day. This is what got him killed later on the cross. The ways that he challenged the old in order to introduce and invite us into the new and better way. He says, all of the law, all these things that they held to and the prophets hang on these two commandments. They were all meant to point to him, and now Jesus brings something new and better their way. And in doing this, he introduced them to something that was far less complicated, but far more demanding. I want to read on for you because actually, in another passage, some of you may be familiar with that. Again, he called all of this out and offered them a different way. Instead of 600 plus commands and laws and rules to keep, he really just narrowed it down to how many here, if you were following along? How many did he mention there? 2 of them, right? Love God, love your neighbor. But then, a little bit later, in another conversation I want to share with you, Jesus took it one step further. I want to draw your attention for a moment to another account that we have by one of Jesus' closest followers and friends, a disciple by the name of John, who wrote in his book, the book of John. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn there to John chapter 13. And I want to read a few verses for you there where Jesus, again, I think takes us even a little bit farther, what we just read about in Matthew 22. In John 13, Jesus now is gathered with his disciples. This is the last night. The disciples don't know that this is happening. They don't know that this is coming, but Jesus surely knows. He's there with his disciples. He's enjoying with them, or at least engaging with them in a very significant meal, what was called the Jewish Passover meal. And in the context of that meal, Jesus, having spent several years with these guys, these disciples, and he told them to follow him, he let them walk with him and talk with him and learn from him, and he tried to pass along to them so many different things. And now here he is as he's spending this time with them in this meal before he's eventually arrested later that night and eventually hung on the cross to die. Jesus says some words to his disciples there that I want to share with you tonight that I think in many ways are the epitome. They summarize so much of what over several years Jesus had taught and said and modeled for them. Let me read this for you, what he says there in John 13, verses 34 and 35. He's sitting around the table with these guys. He says, guys, a new command I give you. Now, they knew all about, many of them probably knew many, if not most, of those hundreds of commands that I just alluded to. They heard Jesus say it's not hundreds of commands, it really comes down to just two. And now it's like he narrows it down even one step further, even now down to just one. He says, a new command I give you. I want to summarize it for you guys. This is what it's all about. He says, I want you to love. The word that's used here is the word we've been talking about together. Not just any kind of love, agape love, as I introduced to you in week 1. He says, I want you to love one another. Pretty simple. Much less complicated, even less complicated than before when I said it was less complicated, but even more demanding than before when I said it was more demanding. And here's why. He says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And he says, by this, by what? Loving one another. Everyone will know that you are my disciples. It's an interesting thing here. Again, Jesus took hundreds of laws and rules and commands of people that had put all their stake in those things. This is how God will bless me. This is how life will be good. If I can keep all of these things and I can follow all of these rules, life will be the way that I want it. God will bless it and he'll be happy with me for it. And Jesus takes all of that and narrows it down to two, and then he takes those two and narrows it even farther, just down to one, which is to love one another. Some of you may say, what happened to the other one, to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and everything else? And here's what I think Jesus was doing here. I think Jesus was actually relaying a truth to them and to all of us as well, that really this one encompasses the other one. You see, what can happen to good religious people at times is we can get caught up in the first one and we do all these things that we are doing as acts of love, or we think that they're acts of love toward God, and then be jerks to everybody around us. And yet I think Jesus would reiterate something that actually this same guy, John, wrote in another letter that he wrote that we have in our New Testament of our Bibles, where he talked about this idea where he said, how can you say that you love God who you can't see when you don't love the people around you, the brothers and sisters around you who you can see? And the reason I'm sharing all of this with you tonight is this, because I think it would be easy for us as guys, but just as people, to walk through a series on being love and to assume that the point, that's just one more little extra thing or layer to add to our Christianity toolbox. If we can do it, it's great. If we don't, it's not the whole thing. I mean, it's just part of it anyways, and on we go. And yet I think if Jesus were sitting here with us tonight and talking to us about this, I think one of the things he'd want us to know before we move on from this series is, according to Jesus, this is what it's all about. What we've talked about together over the last several weeks, being love, doing everything with love, making the bold, strong, courageous choice to do these things that we've talked about together, this is the point. And in some ways, what I think Jesus would say to us is what he said to them: as I've loved you, you love others. And then I think he would say to us this: if we can get this right, we're going to be all right. Are you with me? Now, so that I don't lose you, why don't you look at someone across the table and repeat this after me. Look them in the eyes and say to them, if we can get this right, we're going to be all right. We're going to be all right. It's so important. I think we can get caught up in a lot of other things that miss the point. And I think Jesus says to us, listen, a new command I give you. There's really just one. As I have loved you, love one another. And if you can get that right, then you're going to be all right. I think your decisions will be all right. I think the way that you interact with others will be all right. I think your relationship with God will be all right. I think this is part of what Jesus was saying, and I think it drives us then to the last thing I want to point out to you tonight, which is this. I think his new and better way actually points us to a new and better question that I want to challenge you with, that I hope you'll walk away from this series with, that I hope will you'll hear my voice, or at least the Holy Spirit's voice in the tone of my voice, in your head over and over and over again in every situation you find yourself with, asking this one question, I think the only question we need. It's a new and better question that Jesus puts before us through all of this. And that question is this: what does love require of me? What does love, as Jesus has loved me, require of me? In every situation, not what's the practical thing to do, what's the worldly wisdom that is, would say do this or do that. Not what's gonna benefit me most, or which decision's gonna help me to gain the most out of this. I think maybe even a more important question than what does the Bible say about? Not because I don't believe the Bible, but because I think actually this, through the Bible, drives us to the point of what Jesus created us for and has called us to. And I think if you can answer this question right and love people the way that Jesus has loved you, then you're going to be all right. Sometimes we forget that the early church, they didn't even have the Bible packaged the way we have it yet. It was in process, but it wasn't there yet. His earliest followers were still, all they really had to go by were some words from Jesus where he said, "A new command I give you, to love one another. As I have loved you, so you should love one another." And so I think one of my hopes for the series is, in light of all that we've talked about, this holistic understanding of what love is, patient and kind and not envious and not boastful and proud, all those things that we summarized just a few minutes ago. I hope with all that in mind, that in every situation you find yourself, you'll be driven to really, I think what Jesus would say, the only question we need: what does love require of me? Because I believe that if we can make that right, then we're gonna be all right. I wanna give you a few examples what I think this can look like. Maybe for some of you, when you're in a situation with your spouse, a disagreement, some kind of conflict, what does love require of you? What would it look like to love her the way that Jesus has loved you? When you're facing conflict with someone at work, what does love require of you? When your kids are driving you crazy because they're doing something you told them not to do 1 bajillion times, what does love require of you? When you're tempted to look at something that you shouldn't, pornography, to lust after somebody that would dishonor them, that would objectify them, that it would violate God's intention, his standard for how we treat people. I hope you hear my voice, the Holy Spirit's voice, and the tone of my voice saying, what does love require of me? When we have people in the world in need and we have opportunities to come alongside of them to help them out, people in our neighborhoods, people around the world, people that are different than us but really not that different than us, people that look differently than us or vote differently than us or whatever it might be, what does love require of me? When we find ourselves in all sorts of situations, different things in life where we need to ask ourselves that question, when we're getting tempted to be angry, when people are messing with our idols that shouldn't be there in the first place, when we're engaging people on social media and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, when we're dating somebody, we're wanting to be physically intimate with them. You know, the reason not to be intimate with them outside of marriage isn't because there's a Bible verse to prove you wrong. It's because it's not loving toward that person. You're using them for you with no commitment to them. What does love require of us? I think it's a better question. I think it's the only question we need to do what Jesus actually called us to do. And I don't think Jesus was the only one. I want to end with this tonight. I think actually going back to what Paul said earlier, I think he would say to us the same thing. In fact, if you turn back to that same chapter we've been walking through in 1 Corinthians 13, there's a couple things he says at the beginning verses. We started in verses 4-8. Let me read for you what he said in verses 1-3. He says, guys, listen, if I could speak all the languages of earth and of angels, but didn't love others, I would only be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, just making a lot of noise. He said, if I have the gift of prophecy and I can understand all of God's secret plans and possess all knowledge, even if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but didn't love others, I'd be nothing. If I gave everything I had to the poor and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. But if I didn't love, agape, others, I would have gained nothing. He even goes on even further in a passage we find in another letter that Paul wrote to some churches in the area of Galatia. And here's what he said to them in chapter 5 of that letter, verse 6. He says this: the only thing that counts, some translations say the only thing that matters, is faith expressing itself through what? Through love. Paul's gonna boil it down. He's gonna boil it down to one thing. The only thing that matters according to him, according to his understanding of Jesus and what Jesus taught and what Jesus did and his invitation for us to come and follow him. The only thing that matters is our trust in Jesus to such an extent, demonstrating our faith in him, our commitment to him, our belief that he is who he says that he is, and he's worthy of us following after him. Our faith in all of that expressing itself through everything we talked about the last several weeks. That's the only, according to Paul, the only thing that matters. Jesus says, I have one command that I give you. Paul says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So again, my challenge, my hope, as we move on from the series, you won't remember a lot of things I talked about, but I hope that question, what does love require of me, will stick with you, because I believe if we can get that right, then we're gonna be all right. I wanna give us a chance before we leave tonight to commit ourselves to that together, and we're gonna do that through something we do as a church every once in a while. We've done it at Man Day every once in a while. I wanna give us some space in our last few minutes together to participate in something we call communion. If you're new around church and you're not exactly sure what that is, communion is something actually that Jesus did with his disciples. That same conversation we read earlier in John 13, when he was gathered around the table at the Passover meal with them, Jesus introduced this 2,000 years ago to them, what we're gonna do here together, here in this space tonight as we wrap up. And essentially what Jesus did is he said, guys, I wanna give you something that you can use to remember me, to remember how I've loved you, to remember what I've taught you, to remember what I've done for you. And he took some bread and he showed him the bread and he said, this bread that we're about to eat, this is my body that's given for you. And I'm gonna give you some of it to eat, and I want you to eat it in remembrance of me. And then he took a cup and he passed it around and he said, this cup is my blood that's gonna be shed and poured out. It's going to establish a new covenant. I mentioned to you the old covenant, everything that was in place to point ahead to Jesus and to the new that he would bring into the world. He says this cup represents the new covenant that I'm establishing through my life that's being laid down. For you, when you drink it, I want you to drink it in remembrance of me. And Jesus gave them that, and they ate and drank, and we're gonna take a moment to do that as well tonight as a reminder of his incredible love for us, the ways that he's been patient and kind and not envious or boastful or proud or rude, all the things that we've talked about, the ways that he's loved us, but also as an opportunity when we eat and drink to say, Jesus, not only do we receive and embrace and celebrate your love for us, but by eating and drinking, we're signing up for, Jesus, what you invite us into with you, to in the same way be willing to be broken and poured out ourselves for the sake of demonstrating your love as you have loved us to the world around us. So I wanna pray for you, and I wanna give you a chance. We've got some different places around the room. There's a couple tables up here. I think there's 3 or 4 along the backside of the room. And I wanna just give you a few minutes. And if you're a follower of Jesus here tonight, if you're not a follower of Jesus, you know what? You're not on the hook for the stuff we've talked about. I hope that you'll choose him and embrace him. I think your life will be better with Jesus. May not be easier, but it will be better with him. But if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus tonight, this is an opportunity for you to remember and reflect and to celebrate his love for you, but also as a way for you to say to him and to all of us again, sign me up, Jesus. I wanna love as you have loved me and to be broken and poured out for the world around me. So let me pray, and you can just, as you're ready, you can make your way to one of the stations. There's some pieces of bread in a basket. You can take one of those and dip that into the juice and then just eat that there on your own as you kind of make your way through. And once it looks like everybody's had a chance, then I'll grab our attention again. Sound good? Let me pray for us. Jesus, we love you. We praise you. We're in awe of you. We're overwhelmed by your goodness and grace toward us. Jesus, we thank you that you didn't come just to die and rise again, but to show us how to live. You lived your life here. You walked and talked and taught and modeled and demonstrated what it looks like to be who we were made to be. Jesus, thank you for loving us in so many unimaginable and unthinkable and undeserved ways. Would you help us to not only understand your great love for us, but to choose to show that love to the world around us as well. Jesus, we thank you for the gift of communion, to be able to eat and drink in remembrance of you as we do. We confess our belief, our hope, our trust in you, as well as our commitment to be love to the world around us. We love you, Jesus. Be with us in this moment in a special way. Pray in your name. Amen. We'll give you